Thank you for watching this video on my learnings around Postman, REST API, and Git. So here we're going to focus in on Git in this video, and I'm going to talk through some of the collection pieces I've set up. I'm going to try and figure out a way to share this in a safe way, but I'll kind of step through it, at least in the video here, so folks have that as a resource. So for my Git collection, I've grouped it into 4 folders. The first one being utilities. So Git init is something that you would need to run first and foremost to make sure your environment, your TM1 or PA cloud environment can talk to GitHub. So in the body of the message, you'll mention, hey, what's the GitHub URL? What do you want to call this deployment from? And that's the name that's what GitHub will call this deployment location. And you need a GitHub authorization token. I had a previous video on talking how to get those, and just force it to be true because you're using a REST API call. And then whenever you want, you can always run git status. So here we're looking at a number of headers, and the headers in particular I'll call out. You'll need the authorization header added. I use mine as an environment variable, and the content type needs to be application JSON. Without those 2 pieces, you'll likely won't be able to connect to your instance. And whenever you want, you can hit the send key to run that one. Once it comes back, it's just going to confirm that, hey, things look good. And you want to see that you've got connected true. If you've got connected true, then the connection between your PA cloud or any kind of planning analytics location as well as GitHub is working fine. And it'll also tell you what branches are active or which branches have things in them, and if there's any tags out there that are in use. So that's helpful to know. The Git status doesn't change anything, so feel free to run it anytime. It's a good testing one to just validate that your connection is fine and things are connected as needed. So as we get into developing pieces, we have to think about the TM1 project. So there's not a lot of, I couldn't find a lot of good resources. There's a couple of good blog posts on TM1 project, but the way I would describe the TM1 project is what's the stuff you would put in a folder to promote from one environment to another. So traditionally, if you're promoting objects from one environment to another, you'd likely go into the data folder on maybe your development server, cherry pick a bunch of file system objects, maybe a .cub file, maybe the .rux file or the rule file, probably some dimensions, if they're new dimensions, maybe some subsets, maybe some views. But you cherry pick all the different objects that you need, kind of copy them into a different folder, maybe then copy that whole folder from your development server to your QA server. And then from that folder, copy them into the data folder, and then restart the service, and then hope the objects showed up, and that your server didn't take too long to restart. So that works, and we're like a lot of us are doing that today, but it does require a service restart, and there's not an easy rollback mechanism. So one of the things I do like is that this has a much easier rollback mechanism. Also, I'll demonstrate that today. So for what I'm working on right now, if I look at my TM1 project, if I were to, I'll use this first one here. So both my copy and my TM1 project, it's the same thing. So if you look at the URL at the top, and all these REST APIs are really related to the URL. So the red bits are going to be references to, in my case, environment variables. So they could change by environment. So the protocol, the server name, the instance. If they change by environment, totally okay. I just change that in the environment variables, and then I just change which environment I'm connected to, and I don't have to change anything else. But here I'm connected to dev right now, and I want to use a put method on my TM1 project. And this is going to say, this is me defining what are the objects I'm working on right now that I want to include. Like what would be the things I would copy from my dev data folder into maybe another folder to get ready for a promotion. Now they use this funny double negative syntax. So in the ignore section, we're saying what stuff do we want to ignore, and then what stuff do we not want to ignore. So ignore all my chores, ignore all my cubes, but do not ignore. So the exclamation mark before the cubes here says do not ignore these things. So these are cubes that I'm not going to ignore. And then ignore all my dimensions, but do not ignore these ones. Ignore all my processes, but do not ignore this process, this one process. So then if I were to send this one, I send that. This is using the put method on my TM1 project to say this is the project that's on that server right now. Why that's important, I'll get to in just a minute, but let's also check. The very next one is a get. So I want to just validate, hey, I put something there. If I try and get it, does it give me the same thing? So I just do a get on that, and I see all the same stuff. So this confirms that I've set the TM1 project correctly to say, hey, if somebody wants to push stuff in from this environment, this is what they would push. So that's the next piece we're going to do, is the push. As we look at our push pieces, there's two pieces to wrap your head around. First is a push. So this is from a particular environment. Maybe this is an on-prem data folder, or maybe it's a PA cloud server. But using the REST API, I want to push stuff from that data folder into my GitHub repository. So from where the files live to GitHub repository. So when I do that on the body, I need to say, well, what's the branch I'm gonna push this to? I'm still experimenting with best practices, but for what I found success to have a different branch for all the different kind of initiatives or projects I'm working on. So in this case, I'm calling it security updates. So I've created a branch in GitHub called security updates. And I'm using a global variable for branch. So whenever I reference it anywhere in any of these calls, it's going to be talking about the same branch. I don't need to, worry about mixing that up. So it's going to push to this branch. I can type in some kind of a message here that I would want to have with this push into this branch. Author name, author email are global variables. GitHub authorization token is an environment variable. Could be a global. But yeah, so this push, all it's going to do is it's going to say, for the objects that are ready to get pushed from that environment based on the TM1 project, what does that look like? So let's hit send to start generating that. So now let's come back with the plan. Notice how the plan has a specific ID here. It's reiterating, yep, we're going to that particular branch. And here's a list of my source files. So everything's going to have a .json file that references or describes the thing. And then it's also going to have some other supporting files. So notice this list is a lot longer than what I described. And that's because for something like a cube here, for my security.group cube, I've got a JSON file describing the cube. It's got the rules file. It's got a view, and then for my other cube, it's got the JSON describing it, a default view, a second view, and the same kind of thing all the way down. It's got all my views, my rules, for all those different cubes that I mentioned, as well as the TM1 project file itself gets put in there. And for a TI, it's got a JSON to describe the TI, and then all TIs end up as a .ti text object in GitHub. So this is all the stuff that would get pushed into GitHub. And I've got a little trick I used here, I found from some other tutorials, is using this code snippet here, you can just parse the response body. So the response body is what we got back. And I want to put this in a global variable called pushPlanID. So this guy here, this pushPlanID that represents this plan, it's actually a parameter to the next thing I want to run. So rather than having to kind of remember to key it in, maybe I get it wrong, maybe I don't, this is just going to take that risk away. So it's going to parse the response body for me, look for this ID in it, grab that ID, and put it into a global variable called pushPlanID. And then on my next one, I just need to reference that pushPlanID here, and it uses the right one. So if looking at my plan, my push plan, if this looks correct, these are all the things I expected. That list looks correct. I can just say push, and I do send on that one, and then that will execute that. In this case, it came back with a 204 no content. That's okay. This stuff's already been pushed in. There's no changes. So GitHub's smart enough to realize that all the things that I wanted to change, they already match everything that's in that I wanted to push. So there's really no change. That's okay. But now we know that we can be confident that whatever I had in dev matches what's in the repository. So what if we wanted to promote this to the next environment, maybe to QA? So let's talk about a pull. So now for a pull, I want to go and change my environment from dev to QA. So on the top right, I'm making that selection, just dropping down to switch my environment. And now instead of pushing something, and I want to be pulling something out of the repository. And just like with a push, pull works on the same principle. So I've got the same kind of code here and in the tests section here to parse the response body, put it into my pull plan ID global variable, so I don't need to worry about stuff. But let's just step through it. So for a pull, I say, well, what branch do I want to pull? My authorization token. And then let's run this here. So now it's come back with a plan. It's looking at a particular branch. It's listed me my operations. Okay, so look at that. It says skip. Skip, 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 skip. So because these dimensions and cubes already exist and they're the same, I don't need to do anything. I just skip it. That's okay. But it's helpful to have them in there to know that, hey, they're required for this thing that I'm updating. So I want to make sure that if they're not there, they get created. And it's also identified, hey, there's some updates to a couple of cubes. These are different, so we have to update those. Okay, that's fine. This looks good. And there's my ID. And let's just check. 52F. If I look at the next one, the pull plan, there's 52F. So put that in the right spot in the next call. So let's execute that. And look at that. It came back with an error. It said update cubes failed. Failed to create yada 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 because an element cannot be found of type element. Previous operations are rolled back. So it didn't end up in this is demonstrating that, hey, I'm going to promote a view that needs a particular element. That element wasn't in my list, and because it checked for all that stuff, it rolled everything back. So I know right away that, hey, I forgot an element. I need to either include that element in my TM1 project so it gets created, or I can just manually create the element so that it's there when I need it. But I really like that it rolled everything back for me, so I don't end up in this inconsistent state, and I don't copy the view over thinking everything's fine. Because right now, if a user went to open up that view, it would be broken, and I might get support requests around that. So here in this video, we've talked about Git, we talked about init and status, we talked about how we can, I call this copy. And this is the things I want to copy. So I'm defining my TM1 project. I'm putting my TM1 project on the server, typically in dev. But you can kind of use the same idea to go from QA to prod or any combination. And then we're going to check, hey, if we get the TM1 project, what's there to be promoted? We push, if we want to push stuff into our repository, what is it we want to push? We want to execute that plan. And then once it's in there, we change the environment to QA, and we want to pull that branch into QA. What's the plan for that? That looks good. We execute the plan, and we're good to go. So all of these steps can move objects safely between environments without a server restart. None of this requires a server restart to move objects between. It can all be done with a live running environment, which is, I think, quite helpful. Particularly if you have an environment where it can take an hour or two to restart. This makes things a lot more flexible. Thanks for watching.